Alright, so extrapolation is one thing you want to avoid. Again, really our models are only good between the minimum and maximum x values of our data. But another thing you want to avoid are outliers. So recall that when calculating sample means, we were warned that outliers can have a big effect. Well, because least squares lines are built off of means, and standard deviations for that matter, you might think the outliers would have a big effect on the regression line, and you would be correct. Outliers in regression are observations that fall far from the cloud of points. So these points are especially important because they can have a strong influence. One single point can completely change your analysis. So let's look at 3 examples here. You see here are the regression lines and the residual plots for these 3 graphs. And the question is, what kind of influence? What are the outliers and what kind of effect do they seem to have? Well, for this first graph, you can see there is an outlier right there. And in terms of the effect, that's where the residual plots come into play. And it's not really clear, so it's not having a big impact, but if you look at the residual plot, the residual plot seems to be a little bit slanted. That's the effect of the outlier. So in this case, there is some influence. Maybe not a huge amount, but there is some influence to it. On the other hand, for number 2, you have this outlier. It's right on the line. I think without that outlier, probably would have just about the same line anyway. So I don't think it doesn't look like doesn't have much of an impact on the line. And the last one, this one has a pretty clear impact. You can see there's the outlier, and again, if you look at the residual plot, there is that whole going downwards again. And this one seems to be even clearer than the graph part 1. So look at them a little closer. For part 1, there is one outlier far from the other points, though it only appears to slightly influence the line. For part 2, there is one outlier on the right, there. Though it is quite close to the least squares line, which suggests it wasn't very influential. And then part 3, we got these one outlier here. Is far away from the cloud, and this outlier appears to pull the least squares line up on the right. Examine how this line around the primary cloud doesn't appear to fit very well. I mean, if you got rid of that one point, well, get up here, let me clear that off. If I got rid of this one point, this line would change noticeably. You would notice the slope would be a lot less. It would probably be a little bit taller, a little higher up. It certainly would. It certainly, as it is right now, the line isn't fitting the rest of the points very well. All right, give you a moment to see what you can think about the influential points for these. So here are 3 additional plots, and for each scatter plot and residual plot pair, identify any obvious outliers and note how they influence the least squares line. All right, so for number 4, for part 4, in this case, there's a cloud of outliers. So there's a primary cloud, and then there's a secondary cloud of those 4 outliers. And there definitely seems to be a clear influence. If you look at the residual plot, the main cloud is definitely going downwards. That means that those points are influential. For number 5, for part 5, this one is a little trickier. I mean, this would certainly be influential. If I got rid of this one point, the other dots are basically looks like a vague swarm. I'm not really sure what's going to happen with the rest of the dots. I mean, maybe the line could be like that. Maybe it could be down like there. I'm not really sure what's going on, what would happen with the line if it wasn't for that 1 point. So from the looks of it, this 1 point is basically controlling the entire slope of the line. So definitely influential. And then part 6, there is one outlier right on the line. If you got rid of it, it doesn't look like the line would change at all. So this one is not very influential. Alright, so you've been kind of hearing the terms influential, not influential. Well, the influential ones are the ones we need to watch out for. Points that fall horizontally away from the center of the cloud tend to pull harder on the line, so we call them points with high leverage. And if it's enough leverage, you can completely change your analysis with one single point. If one of these high leverage points does appear to actually invoke its influence, then we call it an influential point. Usually we can say a point is influential if we got rid of that point and refitted the line, then that new line would be unusually far away from the point. So I'll kind of give you an extreme example. Kind of imagine I have 100 points right here. And at the coordinates 17, 0, where x is 17, y is 0, imagine I put 25 different points. And then imagine I have 25 more points at 18, 1, 25 more points at 19, 2, 25 more points at 23. So 100 points. If you look, you can see the line goes through it perfectly. This is one where the correlation is a perfect 1. So positive correlation, perfect. Now let's imagine I fit one additional point at the point 0, 20. Now if you notice in terms of the new line, it's now negative slope. And in fact, I end with a correlation of negative 0.46. So that 101st point, I had 100 points that were perfectly linear. That 101st point changed the correlation from a perfect 1 to negative 0.46. So in a study, that would completely change your analysis. One warning, it is tempting to remove outliers. Basically, don't do this without a very good reason, such as an obvious typo. You need a good non-statistical reason. Models that ignore exceptional and interesting cases often perform poorly. So for instance, if a financial firm ignored the largest market swings, those outliers, they would soon go bankrupt and by making poorly thought out investments. Statistically, what we do is that we'll do the analysis with and without the outlier and then see if it makes a difference. If it doesn't make a difference, then it's not really that influential and we don't worry about it. If it does make a difference, generally we'll report it both ways.